Hello, my name is Samantha Keller, and I'm going to be discussing my unit plan revision. So I took a unit on poetry for second graders from the North Clackamas County Schools in Oregon. And this was a really great unit, and I wanted to do something in English language arts, and I thought poetry, with April coming up, National Poetry Month, that we would be going into this anyway as a class, and I thought, how could I work on this project but also do something really effective for my class, my specific class this year. And every year I know I struggle a little bit with my students, especially my boys, in Poetry Month when we're reading and writing poems. It's not always interesting to students, and it's not always effectively taught. It's more so rushed through. We're going to read the same couple of poets. It might be a little bit over their head, and we move on. So I thought, how can we make this more relevant and more responsive to their different cultures? And so I teach in Wilmington, North Carolina at Wrightsboro Elementary School. And Wrightsboro is 99.5% free and reduced lunch. We have 39.1% students that are white. 33.6% of my students are African American. And 19.6% are Hispanic. I couldn't find a demographic on boys and girls ratio, but in the 5 years that I've been there, it really does feel like there are a lot more boys. I always have a significantly more amount of boys than girls. This year I have 14 boys and 6 girls. So I mean, it's just always really extremely different, but I couldn't find that anywhere. And so the unit that I am modifying had 15 lessons on poetry, reading poetry, understanding different ways to write it, hearing it, seeing the breaks, seeing the repetition, knowing great words, and then actually writing your own poem, revising it, drafts, and final edits. And it came with this great rubric for the students to see as the lessons were going on and create their own. And I felt like it was a really great unit, but it wasn't very culturally responsive or relevant to my specific group of second graders. So I started with a point of view, and I wanted to make sure that my students, I could access their prior knowledge and really front load the academic vocabulary that they needed. So this point of view specific lesson starts with really focusing on an item in the classroom and how you can write a poem about basically anything. And so they talk about a pencil sharpener and then also about a ceiling. So I want to make sure my students know what that is, how many different ways can that look, what does it sound like, is it always electric and you have a portable one. Talking about pencil sharpener, obviously a ceiling is a ceiling, but wanting them to know exactly what the poem is talking about before we even introduce the poem. And so my students would read these 2 poems, and then they would try to look at it in their own fresh way. And so this is where we would kind of teach them everything they need to know. They would read this poem, and they would see, oh, you can look at a light or a lamp, a cup, and write a poem about it because it's curved a certain way and it has a color and the light might hit it. So just so that they see that they can look around them and see things in a fresh new way. And so the second lesson is one that both of my group members critiqued a little bit. So I see that I need to kind of tighten that area up. This is where you listen for line breaks in poetry. And so I really wanted to connect that with music because we don't just flow it all down. You know, there's spots where we have a bridge and a verse and chorus, and we want to make sure that it is perfectly spaced out and you can hear the breaks, you take that breath. It's very effectively getting its point across. And so I wanted to play 3 clips from songs that my 3 demographics could relate to. So I found a Kanye West song. I found a song called Los Monstruos Van al Peligro, and that is by the Doobie Kids, which seemed similar to a Kidz Bop version in Hispanic language. And then the Let It Go song from the Frozen soundtrack. And I just would play these songs for my students and maybe show the lyrics and kind of how can you see where it breaks and what does that sound like. And then relate that to the 2 poems that are provided in the unit. One is about an aquarium and one is about fireworks. And one of the questions was, would my students know what those 2 things were? And so I did just assume that they would, but that was a great suggestion to maybe make sure I've accessed that prior knowledge also. Do we know what a firework is? When do we see them? What does it look like? And then the same with an aquarium. Even though there is one here in Wilmington, maybe they've never been there. So going into that a little bit more would be a great suggestion, and really looking into what it breaks up with. And on the third day, this is where you can hear the music and poetry and how writers rewrite and they edit and they draft. And I found this really wonderful clip about Pharrell Williams talking about Jay-Z and Jay-Z's writing process. When he hears music, he starts mumbling words and he goes into the booth and he records it and then he edits it and he fixes it until it's the perfect way he wants it. And so I thought that that would be a good hook for my boys, especially my African American boys, because I do struggle getting them hooked in literacy and especially with poetry in the past. So I thought that would be a good hook to introduce the editing and revising concept. That day, that one of the poems that we are reading is called Things, and I know my students would understand that, but one of the words that's used is called is shore, S-H-O-R-E. And being from the Northeast, we used that word a lot when talking about the beach, but I haven't really heard it here in the South. So I wanted to make sure that my students understood what that was and what it's just another word for a beach. And this is where I would show my students a big anchor chart, strategies that poets use. And one of the words on the anchor chart is the word precise. So I would make sure my students had that academic vocabulary and they would understand the meaning of precision. Over the next few days, we would discuss different things that poets do and how they can make a big poem out of a little thing or a little moment. And I found wonderful, wonderful resources on Kids Like Us that would make it more meaningful to my students, where they could see themselves in poems and they could see that people like them were writing poems and reading poems. So I found a great book called Angel Rides Bikes and Other Fall Poems, and that would be that big idea into small moments. I also found Deshawn Days that talks about places have big meanings, so just being in different places has a big meaning. And then I found Speak to Me and I Will Listen, Between the Lines, which discusses feelings and inferences and emotions. I also found a segment called The Way a Door Closes, about a family struggling with a father leaving. So I just really wanted to be able to get my students some of the examples that the unit had for poetry were wonderful, and I knew my students would understand it, but other ones were not as effective to my demographics. I found a little crab and the ocean, and I just didn't feel comfortable using those. When speaking directly to the subject, I found a great poem about a lunchbox and about the Olympics, because these just happened, and I thought that my students would understand that, as opposed to, there was a poem about flowers and a poem about a boy's home, and he talks about like looking out the window, being upstairs, and I just did not think that that was relevant for my students specifically. And as the days go by, I find different memoirs and poems on Kids Like Us that just would really bring my students into it. And I wanted to front load on the 9th lesson. Students are looking at patterns, and this is when they're going to start writing their poem. And I don't want my Hispanic or ESL students to struggle with that freedom of what to write about. So I do give a lot of ideas in the active engagement for what they can write about, that they would understand: getting up for school, arguing with a classmate, getting a good grade, meeting a new person, being new in school, having someone new come to school. These are all experiences that I know my students are going through or have gone through in the past. So I just want to front load with them with those ideas so they can grab one and begin writing about those emotions that they felt during those times. On the 10th day, we talk about feelings. So I wanted my students to draw a heart and compare what's in their heart, what they feel love for, what's special, what do they admire. And also they are going to compare it with a poem called I Got the Rhythm. And this little girl dances based on different things, and I want them to think about what makes them dance and what makes them happy and have that in their heart, because that's also something that they can pull from to write their poems. I have my students working with partners a lot in the 11th through 15th lessons, just so that they are able to bounce ideas off one another, learn from one another. They would be strategically placed, and I just want them to make sure that they are feeling confident in their poetry writing. In the last few lessons, they just begin writing their poems, so I didn't add a ton to that, just constantly showing my class the rubric and having them look back on what's there for them. So that is all that I have here on the rubric. I did break apart, make sure they understand what spaces, punctuation, capitalization means, so that they're not just given a rubric and say, okay, I assume you know what capitalization is because you're a second grader. You can't assume that, so I want to make sure that they really know what's expected for them. And that was all I had, and I really appreciated my group's feedback, and that's what I did and why I did it. Thank you.